Now here's another image that is actually pretty similar to the last one that we looked at. Clouds, lots of sky, not a whole lot of ground in the picture. What it does have, though, are these power lines across the top right corner here. So I'm actually going to open this up in Photoshop and Photoshop out these lines. I'm going to just go ahead and open the image without making much in the way of changes. Actually, it looks like I'm clipping some of the highlights. I'm going to cover those. That's fine. And I'll leave it at that. Now with the image open, I'm going to zoom in a little bit up onto this top corner so that I can take a look at those power lines in a little bit more detail. Okay, and I should be able to get rid of these power lines pretty easily by selecting my healing brush tool. I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush. I'm making this smaller just by pressing the left bracket key. I'm going to Alt-click in this area. That's where I want to replace from. And I'll just paint right down the power line here. And that replaced the first one with sky pretty nicely. Let me try the same thing on the next one over. Just paint right over it. And that also did a pretty nice job. There's a little bit of weirdness right in here. I'm going to select a new cloning point and just paint right over the top of that. And that should do the trick. Still not quite perfect, I see, but close enough for this exercise. Okay, now I've zoomed back out, and you can see that up here in the sky, we don't have any distracting power lines. It's still not 100% perfect. As you can see, there's a little weirdness here in the cloud, but this isn't a retouching video. It's about black and white conversion. So let's move on. Now, I chose this image, of course, because there was retouching work that I wanted to do in Photoshop before doing the conversion. So now I've got it open. I've done the retouching work, and I'm in Photoshop instead of Camera Raw. How do I do the conversion? Well, I could do a couple of different things, as we've seen, but in this case I'm going to create a black and white adjustment layer. Now, we could approach this the same way that we did in Camera Raw. We could begin by pulling down the blues and then adjusting the greens, which we're going to have in the trees and the grass here. But since we're in the black and white adjustment layer and it has presets, why not give a couple of them a try? This would be a perfect scene to use a red filter. So let's see what happens if we add a red filter. As you see, it darkened up the sky nicely, and we actually have some nice tonality in the rest of the image. The clouds are nice and bright in comparison. But to accentuate that a little bit, let's try the high contrast red filter. And again, that darkens the sky even more. And this is kind of a nice place to start. If we want to make additional adjustments, we can just go over and make changes now. I'm actually going to go back to the default and compare that to the high contrast red. And as you can see, this high contrast red really makes a nice difference in the trees. It gives us sort of brighter greens, and those are actually the yellow tones within the trees. Those leaves are standing out really nicely. I think I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see some of this detail more closely. And again, here is the difference between the default conversion and the high contrast red filter. This might also be an interesting image to do a simulation of an infrared conversion. So usually with an infrared, we get really bright plant tones. All of the greens and yellows kind of turn into a glowing effect, and then the sky gets really black. Let's see what happens when we try the infrared here. It's a little bit subdued, actually. Not quite what I was hoping for. In the end, I think what I'm going to do is go back to the high contrast red filter and use that as a starting point for my own custom conversion. I do like the contrast in the sky here, but I would like to accentuate that a little bit more by pulling down the blues. And then I will also do the same thing with the cyan. And that is affecting the tones closer to the horizon. As usual, the magenta slider doesn't really do a whole lot. That's common with landscape photos. So now the major decision that needs to be made is what to do with these yellows and greens down in the ground. Well, I like the contrast between these bright clouds and these trees in the foreground, so I want to keep these trees pretty dark. But I also want to make sure that I have plenty of detail in them between the leaves that have highlights and the darker branches. So I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit on the detail here. And I think what I'll do here is brighten up the yellows just a little bit, and I think that will brighten the highlights. In fact, it might just brighten everything that is plant. Yeah, pretty much. I'll pull down my greens a little bit, although that doesn't really do much of anything. And I think that gives me the amount of contrast that I want here in the trees in the foreground. If I want to make additional changes locally to this contrast, then I can do that with maybe a curves layer later on. And of course, the nice thing about doing the black and white conversion this way is that we've done this in a separate layer that we can turn off or turn back on whenever we feel like it, and if we didn't quite like how those tones turned out, we can always go back in and make further adjustments. And this information is completely separate from our background detail, so our original image is not getting hurt at all. Now what's left to do with this image? Well, if we take a look at the histogram, as you can see, there are a couple of shadows in the image that are almost completely black. The brightest parts in the image are almost pure white. So I think we have a pretty nice tonal layout. The sky is nice and dark. The foreground has detail. The clouds have nice detail. What if we want to accentuate some of this contrast in the sky even more, though? Maybe we'll try that next. I'm going to do that by adding a curves adjustment layer. What I'd like to try here is to brighten up just these clouds, these sort of wispy high clouds, while leaving the background sky color about the same. So I'm going to slide my white point to the left, and that is brightening up those clouds in the sky. And of course, at the same time, you see that it's completely blowing out all of the detail in these clouds down here. But that's okay. what I'm going to do is go to my layers palette here, and I'm going to mask off the bottom of this image from being affected by this curves layer. This should be a pretty good situation to use a gradient on my layer mask here. I'm actually going to update this histogram again. So I'm selecting my gradient tool. I've got my gradient so that it goes from white to black. Black essentially allows the data underneath to show through. So I'm going to start my gradient right up around here, and I will end it right about there. As you can see, now I've got all of my detail back, and in my histogram it shows that there is no longer any highlight detail that is being blown out. Now, because we've masked off the bottom part of this image from this curves adjustment layer, any changes that I make in this curves layer are only going to affect the top part of the image. So, for example, if I come in here and pull down these dark tones further, now I'm basically just increasing the contrast up in this top part of the image. And there we go. Now I've increased the contrast between these clouds and the dark sky. And I have actually darkened up the sky a little bit. I think I might push that just up to about there. And there we go. I think that looks pretty good.